Hey guys, not much going on today. This is episode 117 of Stand Up. Joining me today, author and analyst Tiffany Cross, finally got her on the show, and sociologist and expert on police-civilian relationships from the University of Maryland, Dr. Rashawn Ray, who's amazing. Both join me. Tiffany Cross, Rashawn Ray, my interviews with people at a Black Lives Matter rally last night, and more. I'm Pete Dominick. Time to stand up right now. Hey guys. Thank you very much for joining me here on the show, and thank you to all the new paid subscribers who have joined over the past week. Lots of new people. We are almost to 600. Go to patreon.com/Pete Dominick to support this daily podcast, which I'm producing the hell out of every day. I've got two awesome guests today. I'm going to play some audio from the Black Lives Matter rally at Nyack. My daughter asked me. Ava's like, hey, can we go to this? And I was like, yeah. A friend of hers was going to go. And so we went, and I recorded a few quick conversations with people that were attending the rally. I'll play that for you in a minute. But last night, the President of the United States basically made some pretty scary announcements. I want to talk about that. But before that, just got to mention that the news out of Minnesota, where the coroner's office in Hennepin County has ruled that George Floyd's death was a homicide. That's right. He was murdered. And it was the result of a police officer pinning his neck to the pavement. So that is obviously a story everybody's got to follow. I mean, this guy's going to have to go to jail, right? I mean, a jury's going to convict him, right? I mean, they wouldn't let him off, would they? I mean, that could never happen. Not to mention the other cops that were there that were complicit. Also, yeah, so the president announced last night some pretty scary shit, and the reactions to it have been swift. There was a terrible scene at the White House where people were protesting peacefully, and the president made his announcement, and then he walked over to the church across the street and just held up a Bible. But before he did, he had all of those peaceful protesters gassed and shot with rubber bullets. I was looking at pictures of one guy that was there. He got horrible welts all over his torso. Really ugly scene and terrifying situation in Washington, D.C., and across American cities that have employed curfews in places like New York and Los Angeles. But here is the president's announcement, or at least a short clip from it last night.
That is why I am taking immediate presidential action to stop the violence and restore security and safety in America. I am mobilizing all available federal resources, civilian and military, to stop the rioting and looting, to end the destruction and arson, and to protect the rights of law-abiding Americans, including your Second Amendment rights. Therefore, the following measures are going into effect immediately. First, we are ending the riots and lawlessness that has spread throughout our country. We will end it now. Today, I have strongly recommended to every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers that we dominate the streets. Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
Yeah, we'll see about that. Man, first of all, is he terrible at giving a speech. His syntax is just so bad. It never gets old how bad he is. Reactions to the president's announcement, of course, were swift all across Twitter, on cable news, and everywhere else. Jamil Smith of Rolling Stone said as a reaction, the president declared war on Americans. Terrorism expert and former, I think, Navy intelligence, Army intelligence, Malcolm Nance said, warning, Trump's orders to the military are unconstitutional, no matter it's an open call for racial civil war. The Second Amendment talk was essentially a call on whites with guns to stand by to help. This country will burn now. Death will ensue. Malcolm Nance, that seems a little bit too much, a little bit frightening. Joe Biden responded. He said he's using the American military against the American people. He tear gassed peaceful protesters and fired rubber bullets for a photo. for our children, for the very soul of our country, we must defeat him. But I mean it when I say this. We can only do it together. That is Joe Biden. And I've always said that the canary in the coal mine, the only way anything has changed is when the Fox News and radio talkers that have been supporting him for so long start to turn. Like it sounded like white supremacist and Fox News 9 p.m. host Tucker Carlson did last night.
And the tape raised a troubling question. If you can't keep a Fox News correspondent from getting attacked directly across the street from your house, how can you protect my family? How are you going to protect the country? How hard are you trying? On Twitter the next morning, the president reassured America that he and his family were just fine. The federally funded bodyguards had kept them safe. He did not mention protecting the rest of the nation, much of which was then on fire. He seemed aware only of himself. For people who like Donald Trump, who voted for Donald Trump, who support his policies, who have defended him for years and years against the most absurd kinds of slander, this was a distressing moment. The first requirement of leadership is that you watch over the people in your care. That's what soldiers want from their officers. It's what families need from their fathers. It's what voters demand from their presidents. People will put up with almost anything if you do that. You can regularly say embarrassing things on television. You can hire Omarosa to work at the White House. All of that will be forgiven if you protect your people. But if you do not protect them, or worse than that, if you seem like you can't be bothered to protect them, then you're done. It's over. People will not forgive weakness. That's the one thing. By the way, that is not a partisan point. It is human nature. Nero is the only Roman emperor whose name most people still remember. Why? Because he abandoned his nation in a time of crisis, and 2,000 years later, we still don't forgive him.
I mean, I forgive Nero. Not really familiar with his work, but I just don't want to agree with anything Tucker Carlson said. But I do think that that point was, it's pretty interesting and very important when the almost all white men who support this president, and no matter what he does, Tucker Carlson is sometimes critical of him, but when they start turning, and then he went in on Jared Kushner as well, really hard, talking about how Jared Kushner's contempt for Trump's supporters. It was pretty interesting, and I think that we should be watching those guys and seeing what they're saying. I mean, I'm not telling you to watch their shows, but just watch and listen, see if they start to turn on the president because he's such a miserable failure, old bunker boy himself. By the way, apparently that's why he went to that church last night, because he was really mad that everybody was making fun of him for being such a weakling and hiding in the bunker and turning the lights off on the White House like it was Halloween and didn't want any more trick-or-treaters coming over. Kamala Harris, who everybody's best bet for Joe Biden's vice president running mate, was on CNN with Chris Cuomo last night. This is what she had to say about the president's comments.
Chris, I think that Donald Trump has combined the worst of George Wallace with Richard Nixon. When he talks about end it now and then dominate the streets, dominate, it literally, one iteration of dominate is about supremacy. And that's what Donald Trump is about. And let's be clear about it. He has spent full time from the time he ran for president throughout his term in office, full time trying to sow hate and division among the American people. And what he is right now doing in terms of invoking the American military, threatening the American people with the American military, use of the American military against its own people. He is not a commander-in-chief. He is a divider. He is clearly scared, and he cannot meet this moment that he has partly created because of his inability to understand the pain and the suffering. Right now, America is raw. Her wounds are exposed. And instead of having a president who understands it, who empathizes, who lifts up the spirits and acknowledges the pain, we have someone who chooses to hold up the Bible like a prop for his own political gain and for a photo op. And that's just the reality of where we are. Look, in the history of America, we have to have leaders who acknowledge black people have been treated as less than human in the history of our country. And presently, when you look at what happened to George Floyd, And America has never fully addressed the historical and systemic racism that has existed.
So, Senator,
and instead of having a president who does that, we have someone who fans the flames. And that's where we are right now.
Well, I'd love to hear where you are right now. So let me know what you think of all this. I think I'll just say it right now. It is Tuesday, and let's plan to meet at 8 p.m. tonight on Zoom. 8 p.m. Tuesday, June 2nd. I will see you on Zoom, and I'd love to hear from folks and get your reactions to everything that is happening in America right now. I haven't even mentioned the fact that we are still dealing with a pandemic where now over 100,000 Americans have lost their lives. And we're not even thinking about it that much right now because of the craziness that is breaking out in American cities and streets as a result of the death of George Floyd and others, the police brutality that we've seen in America over the past few weeks, which has been so high profile. So I want to get to my guests. I'm really excited. Both of my guests joining me on today's show were and are amazing. I talked to Tiffany Cross for like an hour, and I talked to Dr. Rashawn Ray for over half an hour. He was very, they were both amazing guests. I'm super excited to have had both of them. But before I get to that, I want to play just a quick clips, conversations I had with 4 or 5 people last night in Nyack, New York, which is a river town, we call it, on the Hudson River, just north of New York City. And my 15-year-old Ava and I went over to the Black Lives Matter protest and marched with them. I've got photos and video on my social media. Great group of people, completely peaceful. And here are a few of the conversations I had with them. Hey, can I ask you guys what brought you out here today?
Yeah, so I came out here today because thankfully a lot of people have been coming out recently, even though this is a fight we've been fighting since probably the day we were born. Probably since I'm 20, and I've had a black brother for 20 years that has been afraid for his life for his whole life. I've been afraid for my life, my friends' lives for my whole life, and we're sick and tired, and we're happy that more people are joining us, but this is a fight we've always been fighting, and this is something that we're going to have to keep doing for the rest of our lives. So I hope that this doesn't die down. I hope that we keep coming to the streets. I hope that I don't have to keep fearing for the lives of others, and that there's justice.
How would you name the problem if you can?
I would name it systemic racism that's ingrained in all of our systems now. In our justice system, for one, we see slavery in our justice system so deeply, and people are fearing our police officers. And if we think about that, that's a very frightening thing, because who do we turn to then? We can't call the cops. Who do we turn to? So I think that when our justice system starts actually serving justice, we'll become much closer to peace.
Very well said. Have you been to a protest before?
Yes, I have.
What specifically is the injustice that you're upset about?
Police brutality, sir. What else would I be upset about?
Fair enough. What do you hope to achieve being at a protest like this?
To hopefully make these politicians wake up, since this is the only way we can get things done, and change the system. Start from the bottom up. Let's take it all down and start over from scratch.
How old are you?
I'm 18 years old.
Is this your community here in Nyack?
I do live in Nyack, yes, sir.
Thanks for talking to me.
No problem.
Thank you, guys.
No problem.
You're a member of this community?
Yes.
How do you feel about this protest today happening here today? Have you had anything like this before?
Well, they're having ones in different areas throughout the county.
Yep.
But I think this was the most poignant.
How would you articulate what the injustice that you're trying to overcome is?
Well, it's just that, it's been happening for hundreds of years. It's a systemic problem that is still pervasive throughout the whole entire community today.
Can you name the problem?
Racism.
Thank you.
I'm 27 years old.
Where do you live?
I live in Rockland County.
Have you been to other protests like this before?
I haven't been to any protests yet, but I've seen many online. And I just want to say I support people, no matter what color they are. I support justice. I support equality. I'm not for police brutality. I'm not for this hate and this rage and this anger that society puts on black people and people of color. And I want to say thank you for you and for everyone who's supporting us. Please continue your support.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you a member of this community?
No, I'm not actually. I'm a member of Rockland County, but I live in Spring Valley.
And have you been to a protest like this before?
No, this is my first one.
What do you hope to achieve being here or be a part of?
I mean, that's hard. That's hard to say.
Sure.
I mean, there's only so much you could hope for now, you know.
What do you feel is the main injustice?
The main injustice is that people are still treated as unequal, you know, and that not everyone gets the same opportunity that other people have, and people are dying, and it's sad.
How old are you?
I'm 19.
Thanks for talking to me.
No problem.
Good luck. Yeah, be safe. All right. Would you believe, by the way, that I searched for like 10 minutes for a sound effect to divide those segments? This thing right here that you barely even heard. Oh, the things I do to produce a quality show here for you. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'm very happy to have both of my guests joining me today. I'm really familiar with Tiffany Cross's work, but we've never actually spoken just on social media. We're like Twitter friends, and we're both often on MSNBC shows, but we never have crossed paths, never been on the same show at the same time. But there's kind of a mutual admiration there, as you can see here at the beginning of our conversation. But she's got a new book, which is, I've read the whole thing, actually. I read almost the entire book, and it's coming out in July. I really think you'll love it. It's called Say It Louder, Black Voters, White Narratives, and Saving Our Democracy. She was a 2020 resident fellow at Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics. She's a regular analyst on MSNBC, a longtime cable news veteran. She used to be the D.C. bureau chief for BET and a lot of other things. She's great. I really enjoyed talking to her. I'm looking forward to having her on more throughout the summer in anticipation of her book release in July. But you can pre-order Say It Louder right now. I highly recommend it. Great forward by Dr. Michael Eric Dyson. Here now is my conversation with Tiffany Cross, who's on Twitter. Follow her there at Tiffany D. Cross. So I finally have got her, Tiffany Cross. I've been a fan. I've been watching. I've been throwing all kinds of social media stuff her way, and she mine, and we've got a social media relationship, but this is the first time we've been talking, that we've talked, and we've been talking for 10 minutes before I press record. Very happy to have you. Congratulations on your book. That doesn't come out till July, but everybody should pre-order.
Thank you so much, Pete. And let me just say, I love your voice, and when you're on, you always add, and these times I'm so angry, but you always add this tone of kindness and compassion and come togetherness. So bravo to you for being able to maintain that sense of just humanity in these times.
So thank you very much. What do you think that it is, before we get into the guts of the book, which is so good, and we're just going to have to do more interviews because I'm barely probably going to scratch the surface, even though I've read almost the entire thing and I'm so prepared. But what I wanted to ask you, like, what frustrates you? What do you think it is about people who don't understand racial injustice or people who aren't curious about it? I guess I've always just been curious about it and been wanting to learn more. And I'm always embarrassed, as I was when I was reading your book, that I didn't know a lot of things that you wrote about, especially in the historical part of the book, which is so good. What do you think about people who aren't curious about racial injustice?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't typically engage people who aren't curious about things. I think that's how this country has started to destroy democracy, because there's a lack of intellectual curiosity. And that it's helped people buy into this false narrative about who America is. And that's why people are able to perpetuate that lie and help fuel systems of white supremacy that this country was built on. When you think about the massive amounts of wealth that Black people created for this country as an enslaved people and have never been the beneficiary of it. And so when you hear, a lot of people who lack that kind of curiosity and who seem to always say, like, let's move on from issues of race already. But when it comes to what happened to the Jewish community, it's never forget. When it comes to 9/11, it's never forget. But when it comes to Black people who built this country under violent white rule through backbreaking labor, it's let's move on already. And, fuck that. Like, I don't support that. We can curse on your podcast, right?
I'm allowed to, guests or not.
Sorry, beat me out.
Can you imagine? Anything you want, of course. Yeah. So what do you think, per what you just said, how important do you think it would be for, the federal government, much less a state or local government, to memorialize slavery the way they have in Brazil, the way Germany did the Holocaust in Germany? Because I've heard a lot of scholars say, wouldn't fix anything. But what we need to do is admit how horrible we have treated Black people from the beginning. We need to admit that. And one way to do that would be some major memorial. We have, the African American History Museum in D.C., which is fantastic and which took forever. But what do you think about some kind of memorial to slavery, which is an admission of our past?
Well, I'm not holding my breath for it. And I don't know if that's going to really connect with the people who are still enduring the fallout of what happened during slavery. So great if somebody wants to erect the memorial. There are plenty. There's the EJI in Montgomery, Alabama, which focuses on lynching, which is moving. You mentioned the Blacksonian, I call it, but the National Museum of African American History and Culture. That's a few blocks from me. I mean, these are all amazing things. But when you get to the meat of what's happening, the meat of trying to level this playing field and acknowledge the atrocities that the American government committed against Black people, there is a concerted effort in Congress to prevent that from happening. A gentleman by the name of Congressman Conyers was a big champion of the reparations bill. And when he left Congress, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas has picked up that mantle. And so she's not even introducing legislation to offer reparations. The only thing that she's asking is to create a committee to study the impact of slavery in every industry, in every space of American culture. And even that has been met with resistance by the GOP-controlled Senate. And I don't even know if there's consolidation in the Democratic Party for this. I could be wrong, so fact check me there. But the point is, I think people are so eager to move on that they are afraid to face what happened. They're afraid to acknowledge what happened. Because a lot of people in positions of power are the descendants of people who, enslaved African Americans in this country. Even Ben Affleck, who, when he found out that his family had once owned slaves, the shame of it, he didn't want people to know about it. But what a missed opportunity, acknowledge that, yes, I did this. And because I, Ben Affleck, benefit from this, as a result, here are the action items I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure that I empower Black people, that I employ Black people, give fair consideration, that I bear witness to truth and speak up when I see someone is being disenfranchised or whatever. So as long as we keep running from it, we won't talk about it. It's like if I know that you murdered your brother, okay, and I don't want to, we agree, it's so awful that we don't talk about it. You say, I don't ever want to talk about it again. At a certain point, we're not going to talk about anything because this big shadow over what you've done is always going to be there. So if we can't acknowledge that piece, then this chasm in American society will keep growing.
Yeah, I don't even think,
and that's where we are.
I don't think you even have to make it as dramatic as that. Even if you're in your marriage, if I got in a huge fight with my wife, I can't just sweep it under the rug and expect it to go away. It'll always come back, and it does. Believe me, over 20 years in a marriage. If you have to acknowledge what happened, or it comes back to visit you often in many different ways. So. And you mentioned John Conyers and the reparations bill. He introduced that for like 20 years or something like that. He was in Congress. And you mentioned, just what Sheila Jackson Lee wants to do in terms of research. But as you know, there has been a ton of research on the generational damage that slavery and Jim Crow has done. And there's so much evidence as to what it has done, not only economically, but to the health of African Americans because of what the stress literally of going outside can do. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's generational trauma that exists in our communities, and we've never had the economic benefit of being able to unpack that the way that some communities do. We didn't have the benefit of sending our children to therapy. We didn't have the benefit of even acknowledging what we had gone through. When people were experiencing oppression in the early parts of this century, post-Reconstruction, there was a discord in the Black family because Black men found it difficult to be oppressed all day, to be called nigger on the job, and to come home and have to face a child that you can't feed, to have to face a woman that you can't provide for. And so I think it has always created such heartache in our community, and then to be denied that, even to have people dismiss that pain, and to have people discount what we have contributed to this country and discount how we feel about it. And that's only begun to change in very recent times, Pete. I mean, I think about my own mother. She was born at a time where she couldn't sit anywhere on the bus. I'm really the first person in my family born at a time post Jim Crow. And that wasn't that long ago. I think that's the most frustrating part when people say, let's move on. This shit just went down in the 60s, and things continue. They continue to perpetuate in policy. They continue to perpetuate in our finances. They continue to plague our communities and our education system. So the work has to be done. And we are just not there yet, quite honestly.
Yeah, you write in the book, white supremacy in America is like the iPhone. New versions keep coming out. Each new version does all the same things as the last, but it has a few added features. There's always some bugs to tweak in the more modern operating system, but it eventually functions as designed. It's a perfect but sad metaphor. Explain what you mean.
Well, when people say that our government is broken, and I have to call bullshit, the government is functioning as it designed. When you look at the people who founded this country, who did not consider Black people human beings. And so it wasn't so much that they, and I write about this in the book, but it wasn't so much that they wanted to keep us out of democracy. They never let us in at the onset of democracy. So when it became time to coexist with the people they'd always considered inferior, they designed a system to make sure that Black people knew that they were inferior. And so it's challenging for me. Look, voting is such a powerful tool, and what my ancestors went through to guarantee me full rights of citizenship, I don't take it lightly. But I certainly understand the Black person who is doubtful about trusting a system that was designed to not only hurt them, but keep them out of it. And so when they say, you're asking me to trust this system that has imprisoned me, that has killed my brother, kept my mother impoverished, kept my family living in redline communities, kept my children in dilapidated schools, and now you're saying casting this ballot is going to change that system, they cry bullshit too. And that's the hardest work I think that a disproportionate amount of Black women have to do, is convince them that we're not asking you to believe in this bullshit system. We're asking you to believe in you. Reimagine a democracy that you deserved. And instead of trying to convince people who are not curious about equality and racial justice, who don't feel like it's a worthy topic of discussion, I would rather convince people to have a sense of agency in their own power in shaping this democracy. And because we've for so long been kept out of it, too many people are fearful and distrustful of the way the government functions, because, like I said, it's functioning exactly as it has been designed to function. So before you disrupt it, you do have to become a part of it, a part of the system, to disrupt it from the inside. So
well said, and so well researched in your book. You write all about that specific tenet, but it does seem like a really difficult mountain to climb, challenge to overcome, to convince people who for generations have been locked out to believe, as you say, in themselves, not in the system. How do you think that's going now with the new leaders of the new civil rights movement, however you want to refer to it?
Yeah, so I think we've seen all of these leaderless movements sprout, from Black Lives Matter to the Me Too movement. I don't know if any of these movements can have one face, that's the one voice. But I do think that people are seeing the landscape as it is now and feeling a new sense of empowerment. It's kind of the question you want to ask America. What did you think was going to happen? After 400 years of violent rule and oppression, and then you top off this vanilla sundae with this orange cherry that's pretty much saying fuck you to all people of color, to all women. And now you have this landscape of chaos. what the fuck did you think was going to happen? And so now that people are erupting across this country, it's quite understandable. And revolutions are messy and they are violent, but they are often preceded by violent acts of white aggressors. And so the violence started with police brutality. The focus is now somehow looters and agitators and aggressors. And so I think when people have that disconnect from a mainstream media that, you know, intentionally or not, says that your voice doesn't count as much, now that, you know, we have all these different spaces for content that has democratized the process and have given people a first line account on what's happening, I do think people have a new sense of agency. And I do think people are seeing this is literally life or death now, given the fallout of COVID-19 and now the unrest across the country. I just think there's a new sense of desire to feel empowered and to enact that. And I also think that, you know, Black people stand to suffer disproportionately in this country when we have incompetent leaders. But Black people have survived a lot of devils. Donald Trump is not the first white supremacist in the White House. I hope he'll be the last. But there's been more bigots to run this country than there have people who are not bigoted. And so I think for a long time, Black people felt like, look, we can survive what other people can't. But too many of us didn't survive. And so now I think people are seeing, you know what? I've got to disrupt this system. And that might mean I'm out, you know, yelling and screaming and protesting and holding up a sign, which is fine. But I hope and pray and predict that they will also be as passionate about casting ballots come November.
You mentioned, you know, kind of how the narrative has become about the protesters and not police violence. And I want to talk about, obviously, media with you, because you write in your book, you really kind of blow the lid off of cable news in a way that not too many people have honestly done. And the reason why I think people don't do that is because for people like you and I, it can be our bread and butter. It's good for us to be on TV. We're good on TV, and to criticize the power brokers is not a great way to be invited back on TV. But you know, I think that you do a really great job, a transparently great job, and you can't. Hopefully, I don't think there's going to be any damage done as a result of your honesty. But
we'll see.
But I mean, you name a lot of names, and you have. There's a lot of value, I think, to what you're saying. But one thing was eerily strange, and reading your book, where you described a white woman calling the cops on a Black man for his dog humping hers in a dog park. These particular white people assume that law enforcement is there strictly for them, and that when police show up, they will instinctively be on their side. This is a deeply rooted sentiment of superiority over African Americans, which has been nurtured by an unforgiving criminal justice system that favors white people. You wrote that in this book. You wrote that probably months ago. The book didn't even come out till July, and we saw this Harvard-educated bird watcher on the Audubon Society board have the police called on him by a woman. And that was, you know, I think maybe strike 3 in the latest round of horrific racial injustice that we've been seeing. But you weren't being prescient. You were just saying what happens all the time, right?
Right. And look, I've had these experiences with white women who feel like they have some sense of authority over me for things such as a parking space or even, you know, showing up in a grocery store line. And I think, you know, it's challenging because when you encounter these microaggressions or these very direct and insightful, you know, or aggressions that are meant to incite anger and spark outrage, it can be challenging to maintain your cool. And so you see that more often than not, where Black people have to go out of their way to remain calm in the face of this very irate person who has this sense of superiority that they can control your outcome. And you saw that with Amy Cooper when she talked to the very calm and docile bird watcher. She knew her power as a white woman, and you saw her switch just like that when she was on the phone and started performing, and she was dramatic and sounded like she was in fear of her life. That's what leads to the outcome of a George Cooper. So I really think, look, white women have a unique role in this space and more power than not. And I encourage people to visit the Equal Justice Initiative, the memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, because it honors the lives of so many Black Americans who were lynched, and an overwhelming majority of these Black Americans who were lynched, which include women and children. It wasn't just Black men, just as police brutality does. An overwhelming majority of these incidents were sparked by a white woman. She either said something, made a false claim, or was aggressive with someone that led to law enforcement instinctively being on her side. And so we have to acknowledge racism. It's not just police brutality. It is the white supremacy in which police brutality is bred. And as long as we're not talking about that, I just don't know that there's a solution here, because body cams ain't it, because all that did was give us a better view of Black and brown people being assaulted or murdered. So until we get a better understanding of what's happening, and also some sort of fight back, I'll tell you, Pete, when I saw that video of the police officer kneeling on George Cooper's neck, George Floyd, forgive me.
I do forgive you. It happens so often. We tend to mix the names up. Go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. When I saw him kneeling on George Floyd's neck, I asked an officer of the court, if I were to pick up, I'm 5'2", okay, I can't overpower this man with a gun. If I were to pick up something and knock him over the head, am I assaulting that police officer, or am I saving that Black man's life from a murderer? The law would say the former. But as a woman, I feel like I'm doing the latter. And so as long as we have that chasm, everybody sit around and watch this man get murdered. I understand that. I understand the fear. But at some point, if there's a fear that you're going to fight for your life, perhaps that's the thing that's needed to change. And I know that puts a lot of people in an uncomfortable position and puts so many of us on the front lines of violence. But it's just at the point now where I acknowledge that revolutions are messy and they are violent. And I'm just a little more Malcolm than Martin in this situation, and feel like something drastic has to happen for the preservation of Black life in this country.
It's interesting. Yeah, I've gone down a Malcolm X rabbit hole the past week. I have. I'm watching the old stuff. I played some of his stuff on the podcast yesterday, and it's hard. It's very hard to know how to handle such situations and what the outcome will be. But you also write in the book, I think, something about how it's not like, because I've asked this question a lot to people of color. I've said, do you think that there's more racial violence, or do you think it's just being captured on camera and documented more? And I think you in the book, right, the school of thought, it's not upticks in violence. It's just being noticed more. And I wonder if this latest round, oh God, I don't have the words to make it sound impactful enough. But all these horrible acts of violence against black lives lately caught on camera, Ahmaud Arbery, and of course George Floyd especially. If there is a turning point this time, because we've seen so many of these, the Sandra Blonde video was the one before this that outraged me the most, in my opinion. I've been in that situation a lot of times, and I go off on the police officer because of the privilege that I have. But do you think that this latest round of videos is like a black spring, if you will? Like, do you think this time it's different? Somebody said to me, who was it the other day, said to me, they think that George Floyd, that video was the worst of them all, was bar none the worst thing that they'd seen. That man die that way. I don't know how you categorize such things, but is this time different?
I don't know, because it's not new. Like, we had a series of deaths caught on camera leading up to the 2016 presidential election, and we still got Donald Trump. So I don't know that this is a turning point. I mean, we talked about the Red Summer, we talked about the Civil Rights Movement, and there's always been Black blood to spill across our screens, and then we would see the needle move a bit. So I don't know that this is enough to be a drastic turning point.
It's interesting because, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just want to interrupt you with your own words, because I thought it was really fascinating the way that you wrote about and documented what happened in 1965 on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and how that incident interrupted the already scheduled programming, which was ABC was airing the telecast of Judgment at Nuremberg, a film about the persecution of Nazi war criminals, you write, to show what was happening in Selma, Alabama. And you write this so eloquently about what had happened there and how that seemed to really change hearts and minds. I mean, I feel like that's what you're saying. So why wouldn't all these instances of police violence that we're seeing at some point change hearts and minds as well now for this generation of Americans?
Well, I don't know that it changed everyone's hearts and minds. I mean, look, we're in the information age now. So at that time, everyone wasn't sitting around watching a 24-hour news network.
Yeah.
This was primetime television, and they had to interrupt to see Black women and children being run down by police on horseback. That was a huge deal. So for white people who were able to go about their lives indifferent to everything, just, didn't care to pay attention about these atrocities, it wasn't like they were a secret. They just did not have to face the brutality of what was happening. Once they did have to face it, things changed, but not a lot, Pete. I mean, not a lot. Like this, it moved the needle just a bit, but not in a drastic way. And I think, I've talked to some students, and I think they ask, like, you guys did this, your parents did this, your grandparents did this, and things change a little. Like, how long before we see this real change? And I understand that frustration. And so I don't know that, watching Black tragedy porn is going to change the hearts and minds of people who are either A, indifferent, or B, have no problem with it. Some may conflate the two. But I think, unfortunately, it's going to take more than that this go round, because power concedes nothing without demand. And there may be some well-intentioned people, but not too many people are saying, I feel guilty enough, or I acknowledge this inequity enough that I am going to concede some of my power to you. That's not going to happen. You have to snatch it. You have to take it. And I feel like until we do that across the board, that's not just in politics, but until we demand by evolution or by force, the landscape will have to become more inclusive. We are the rising majority of this country. And I think, as long as there's discord among all of us, it's going to be hard to coalesce and, build coalitions to make that change. But that is what's going to happen. We're going to have allies across the board in every community to say, this is bullshit, and we're here to make this change. And again, revolutions are messy because there's discord among all communities, and revolutions are violent. And so we have to be prepared for that. When we see these standoffs with the police, I mean, I watched this week the LAPD take nightsticks and hit protesters. We watched the police SUV drive through a crowd of protesters. What did that look like? Charlottesville, when a white nationalist drove through protesters. So these are the things that we're seeing. It's nothing new. I just think the response has to be different at this time.
You write a lot about history, election politics, and democracy, and I think the stuff about the civil rights movement that you write about, Johnson and the Southern strategy and things, a lot of people don't really understand what happened and how the political parties changed and evolved in the 60s and who the players were. But once the civil rights movement culminated in the Voting Rights Act, and I think that what is really important, the most important thing in race and democracy to me, and the most kind of underreported and under-discussed thing, is how the Voting Rights Act was gutted by Republicans in the Supreme Court a few years back. And it's the reason why it's important is because it took all of that bloodshed in a generation long movement to get those achievements. And the moment they were gutted, and I remember John Lewis talking about that, and how horrible it was to see those achievements. The moment they were gutted, states reverted back to like that. And you write really, like, your book documents what happened, especially in Florida and Georgia and a number of states in Ohio and Michigan really, really well. Could you talk a little bit about why it sounds like you agree that the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, which was, by the way, reaffirmed by the entire Senate, almost every Republican, and George W. Bush, and then the Supreme Court gutted it when Obama was president. Why is that so important, that moment, and how, as you snapped your fingers, what happened?
Well, let me first just explain for those who may not know. So Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act said that states with a history of voting, oppressing votes had to check in with the federal government before making changes to how people vote. When that went away, they let states run loose. And so a lot of these GOP-led state legislatures were able to reenact the same voter suppression efforts that we saw from decades ago. And so that is something that not only impacts African Americans, but it's something that disproportionately impacts Latino voters, Native American voters, older voters, even older white Republican voters. But Republicans are willing to cut their nose off to spite their face just to make sure that Black people weren't around to vote. And why that matters is because the less people who participate in civic engagement, the better it is for Republicans. So Republicans stand to disproportionately gain when people are suppressed and oppressed, for that matter. So when we saw the voting rights struck down by a conservative Supreme Court, it punctuated the point that this is why these down ballot elections matter as well. The presidential election suck up all the oxygen in the room, Pete.
Yeah.
But it's the Senate who controls the judiciary. It was the Senate who gave Brett Kavanaugh a welcome mat to the Supreme Court. Imagine if Democrats controlled the Senate, Brett Kavanaugh would not be confirmed and the courts would lean left. And so all the legislation that's going to land at the on the desk of the Supreme Court, this is something that we have to think about because these things have sincere consequences. So now here we are in a very consequential election, and we have GOP-led voter suppression running rampant. We have foreign election interference that focuses specifically on Black voters. And now we have the fallout of COVID-19. This unholy trinity can have a devastating impact on this election because it has to be overwhelmingly decisive. Donald Trump has already threatened the peaceful transition of power. And so if it's close, which we should not take for granted that it won't be, if it's close, we could see this type of violence that we're seeing now behind police brutality. We could see that happen for our elections. We can see this Donald Trump wing of the party uprising and committing violent acts. We've already seen them storm the state house in Michigan, and they are disproportionately armed relative to the rest of the country. So, I don't want to be hyperbolic here, but these are real live things that could potentially happen, all because the Republicans have been able to manipulate the rules of democracy to their favor, from striking down the Voting Rights Act, which led to racial gerrymandering. Political gerrymandering is not illegal, but racial gerrymandering certainly is. In North Carolina, the federal court said it was done so with surgical precision to keep African Americans out of the process. In the book, I write about Ohio, Michigan, Georgia, and Florida, where these states they're either swing states or potential swing states that have the most egregious laws that are keeping people from it. And it's not something that gets talked about in the media, Pete. I mean, there have been less than 3 stories leading up to midterms in 2018 that talked about voter suppression. For the most part, the media just bakes it in the cake. And that's bullshit. Like, when we think about stories that matter to us, that is BS, because if white women were being kept from the ballot box, it would be breaking news every night on our TV screens.
I can only imagine. I'm trying to game that out. You do a great job of talking about the importance specifically of Black women throughout history, but especially recently, obviously in 2018, and obviously in the special election. I think the place that it was most obvious was in the special election in Alabama with Doug Jones versus what's his pedophile, Roy. Roy. A fucking monster.
Roy Moore,
Unbelievable, that guy, how close he got. And how much Trump and others supported him. The guy wasn't even allowed to go to malls because of how many young women had reported him. But nonetheless, the importance of Black women in that election was everything. And yet Black women aren't given nearly the credit that they deserve. I think in your book, probably that was the most well-stated and documented that I'd ever read. Granted, I'm not as well read as I'd like to be on some of these issues, but I think you do a really good job. And you also introduced, like I said earlier, me to some historical things that I had no idea about. But you mentioned the Me Too movement, and I think that's a really interesting dichotomy because you say I felt left out of that, the Women's March. Talk to me a little bit about that.
So I didn't feel left out of the Women's March, but I think disproportionately Black women feel left out of these feminist movements. Even, the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s that painted Gloria Steinem as the face of feminism, but not Shirley Chisholm, who was certainly on the front lines of democracy at that time. And so fast forward to today.
Angela Davis.
Angela Davis for sure. And so when you look at the landscape today, there's nuance because this, Me Too movement kind of bled into the Believe All Women movement, which completely discounts the unique Black experience in these types of accusations. I, may lose an amen corner with this, but I will never ascribe to this Believe All Women mantra. When you look at the disproportionate amount of Black men who lost their lives because a Black woman made a false claim, the most famous of those being Emmett Till, but there were so many, I believe I can hear all women. I don't believe all women. And so I think these nuanced points get lost on a movement that choose white women exclusively to be their champion because they think that's a more sympathetic victim. And so when the Me Too movement happened and the Women's March happened, you saw, particularly around the Women's March, you saw a lot of white women start to feel uncomfortable and say, well, this is focusing a lot on race. Well, this was the same thing that happened around the 19th Amendment. Even now, you see the media landscape saying, oh, it's the 100th anniversary of when women got the right to vote. Well, that's bullshit because some women got the right to vote. White women got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. That didn't apply to me as a Black woman. So again, I feel left out of this white-led feminist movement that never takes into account my unique history with this country. And this is happening while people who look like me disproportionately uphold this country, this democracy, and certainly the Democratic Party. So it feels like the intersectionality sometimes leads to a beef. And it's one that I don't always want to participate in. Have
you ever noticed how long your responses are on your cable news appearances?
Too long, probably.
No.
I got to get it in where I fit in.
Well, see, I think that you have a unique ability. A lot of people don't have this. And this has nothing to do with race or gender or whatever. It's personality. You have a unique ability to go for as long as you need to go. And I think a lot of times, the panel, the anchor just kind of knows, let Tiffany go. That's my impression. Because what I'm saying is, like, you started that response about I think there needs to be more nuance. And, nuance comes in a book like yours. Nuance comes in an interview like this. Nuance doesn't nearly often enough come in a cable news panel, which allows me to pivot to media because you write so much about this. And I love that you're able to go for longer and you carry your torch as long as you want until you're done. But even then, you realize that you got to wrap it up at a certain point to be fair to the other panelists who have thoughtful things to say. And you get that. But your book doesn't need to do that. A forum, a talk, a moderated talk doesn't need to do that. Interview like this doesn't need to do that. And all the nuance that you just included in your answer about feminism and what it leaves out is so, so important. But of course, I imagine you agree a lot of nuance is dead because of social media, because of cable news and so on. So let's talk about that. You're a social media star. You're ferocious on Twitter. You're really funny. You're really smart. You're really, I think, intimidating. And that's good. But
I hope not.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't want to, who was it recently? I saw Tangled with.
Who knows?
Tangled with you recently, and it was a big name person who clearly picked on you, and you just finished him. It was last week. I feel like it was a woman, but
I have no idea. I get into these Twitter beefs, and I only have 2 tweets top for people. After that, I am done. So it could have been anybody.
Well, you're better than me. I'll go at it.
If you tell me the topic, I'll know the person.
Get what it was. I just remember I just remember using a fire emoji, and I remember to quote it. I remember it took me a very long time to find the fire emoji, and I was like, "Where the fuck is the fire?" I was like, "Is this worth it?" And I finally got it. No, but the point being that everything is too brief. Everything is too succinct, and cable news destroys so much. And even Sirius satellite radio was doing that for me. I'm so much happier to have a podcast, a long form conversation. But what about cable news? You started your career as a stringer at CNN, entry level in Atlanta. You write about that, and it's really heart wrenching how you write about you as a young person? Because as I'm reading that and how much you kind of were ignored and were taken advantage of, and you just kept coming back for more, I was like, man, if they knew who she was going to become, how did they not spot talent? Maybe you weren't, as talented then. I don't know, but.
Well, nothing has changed. I'm still not employed by any cable news network now.
Well,
so
that's my big question, and this is the hardest question to answer. I think that when Chris Matthews got canceled, got fired, that was the opportunity that MSNBC has been waiting for, to hire a black woman to host a nightly show. CNN doesn't have one. They've got Fred on the weekends, and she's been great for 100 years, but they don't give her a lot of bandwidth. MSNBC has Joy on the weekends, and like I call her show kind of the Black News Hour in a way, because I'm like, she's covering so much black news, and somebody might even argue, all you talk about is black news, Joy, or something. I'm like, well, that's because nobody else is doing it. But that's a couple hours on the weekend, and it's like, it's about time. Like, what are they waiting for? You would be perfect for that 7 o'clock spot. Put put some black woman in that 7 o'clock spot. I've been fighting for my friend Laura Coates at CNN or MSNBC for years. I mean, what's it going to take? This is, to me, the most glaring, outrageous, upsetting thing, that there is not a black woman on cable news, prime time, and nightly.
Yeah. I share in your outrage. So first, let me say that Joy's show is amazing. And I would just say that I don't know that I would say that it's black news, because she talks about so much news that happens to be relevant to a lot of different constituencies. She's one of the few outlets where you'll hear anything about what's happening in Native American communities. I've been on there talking about disaggregating data when it comes to AAPI communities, Asian American Pacific Islander communities. So, I think, unfortunately, the powers that be...
Well, minority news, I mean, like, they're not...
I don't know if minority, because it's, it's the rising majority now. And she also does, like, just regular political news. I think Joy I've been on panels on Joy's show where it's been, the panelists happen to be all black for this segment. But we're not talking about things that are necessarily relevant to black people. We might make a point that's relevant to black people, but the topic could be impeachment. And it's like, it shouldn't matter that it's all black panelists, because the same way that you can have a panel full of white people and one person is, from academia, another person is a reporter, another person runs a PR firm, another person is married to the host, and the host happens to be a white man, Nobody's saying, whoa, this is the all-white show. They're talking about white news. It's like, no, it's a Joy show. I don't even think she considers it. I think it just happens. She's like, oh, we're talking about this. We should get Ellie Mistal on. And we're talking about this. We should get Jason on that panel. Or let's get Karine on. I mean, I think these are panels that they reflect America. She gets Giassi Ross, who's, Native American, great guest. Maria Teresa Kumar, who runs Voto Latino. So I think there's an embarrassment of riches when it comes to talent. But I want to answer your question, because as I go off my too long answers, I just want to make the point that I think decision makers at the cable news networks are catering to an aging, shrinking white audience. A lot of the viewers are over 60 and they happen to be white men. And I would just make the point, those cable news execs have got to realize that audience is not immortal. At a certain point, they are going to be gone, and the network executives are going to be left with this rising majority of America who they have routinely and historically ignored and not given any content, not covered our issues with any nuance or perspective, and they will increasingly get left behind. There's too much begging for our attention. You've got outlets like Quibi now that's all about quick news and bites. You've got Netflix and shows like The Patriot Act, and people doing this news content, catering to an audience that looks a lot more like me and a lot less like them. So until they get on that train, they are going to get run over by it. And that's unfortunate, because I think you see right now with everything that's happening, people are in front of their television screens wishing that this kind of coverage that's giving a voice to the underrepresented could continue for longer.
Well, I'm going to try again, because I think maybe if I phrase it differently, I mean, I think that if Joy Reid has 4 hours on the weekend, she's got 2 hours on Saturday and 2 hours on Sunday.
Yeah.
I think, and I feel this way, and I think you write about this in the book. You talk about that there are just not nearly enough executives, much less executive producers that run the shows. That's the top person that runs a TV show, a cable news show, that are people of color or women of color. And I feel like, and I have felt this way with my show, well, I've only got enough time. I gotta squeeze all these things that are undercovered in. That's what I feel like a lot of Joy's blocks are, her shows are.
Yes.
And my point is, if you had those people in those places nightly, you would not feel that you had to cram all of that in. By the way, on a Saturday and Sunday morning, when not nearly as many people are watching, to their credit, they do draw in a lot of people that make, I think, it destination viewing on the weekends at MSNBC. They've done a great job with that, but that's not when most people are going to be watching. It's during the weeknights in those primetime slots when they get top ad rates and all that shit. That's what I'm saying. Like, it should be spread out over every night for,
Agree.
And
but
I'm just saying it's concentrated on the weekends.
No, I don't disagree with you about that. The only correction I would say is that even though people aren't typically watching news on the weekends, you typically do see a drop off. That hasn't been the case with Joy. She pulls in the same numbers as Morning Joe does. She's averaging. So
how is that not viewers. A lesson for the programmers? Like, based on those statistics.
Exactly.
Like, plug her in at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock on MSNBC, whatever. I mean, I think Rachel Maddow seems to be the only one that seems to be actually, making them money. And I love, Chris Hayes and I love Lawrence. But I mean, in terms of like getting the ratings to sell the ads, if that's the only thing that counts to executives, and it is really, then fine. Put a black person in there and draw it every night.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not even a paid contributor on any network.
That's crazy to me.
I don't understand what the litmus test is, what the value add is, how they determine who is worth getting paid for their time, who contributes. I'm very thankful that I have a lot of people who like what I have to say, and I'm thankful that those people will follow me to different platforms. If I'm on CNN or I'm on MSNBC, the same people will switch over and they'll say that, like, I'm just tuning in to see you. So, I think Joy has carried the mantle for so many people at that network. I think when you walk into MSNBC offices, like, I'd like to see some pictures of Joy on the wall, because they have a lot of pictures of their talent around there. It's like, you feel like
it's so glaring.
And Spike Lee and Do the Right Thing. Why ain't no sisters on the wall?
Well, yeah, but that kind of thing, is so glaringly obvious to anybody who has just any kind of semblance of curiosity or equality. Like, where are the women? Where are the people of color? I mean, you write about MSNBC promoting their, the women of MSNBC, and that was a huge mistake for them. And there was a huge backlash for them because there was a bunch of white women. And you're like, are you fucking kidding me?
How did you not see that? Did nobody notice that? And this is why I say white women have a unique role, because nobody's mad that the white women were profiled. That's fine. I don't even know what the fuck the story was. Like, show me any network that doesn't have 5 white women on TV. But fine. You want to celebrate them? That's great. But this is the role that they could have played. And maybe they did, because I don't know. But somebody could have said, well, guys, shouldn't we include Joy in this? Because she hosts a show on the network. And right now we're just all white women on this show. The PR department. Could somebody say, well, wait, this isn't very diverse? LA Times themselves that ran the article, could they say, do you have any diversity at the network that we can highlight? But we have to keep demanding it. And the crazy shit about all this is, Pete, Black women disproportionately watch MSNBC. Our eyes and our dollars fund the network.
Should have made that point. Yeah, I should have made that point first. Yeah. You make it in the book. I know I'm running out of time with you, but I want to ask you one more thing about something I learned this year is really important and fascinating. And I think that you put it, and I copy and paste this into my notes in a way that nobody else has put it so eloquently, just the way that you're framing of it. But you have this great, I forget, I should have the notes, what chapter it is, but
if you tell me, I'll be able to tell you.
Well, you write about Ralph Northam and the governor of Virginia. Yes. And you say, this is the guy who obviously, hold on, they're coming to get you. What is that?
I know. I live by a fire house.
Oh,
and so
really?
I hear sirens all the time.
Oof,
so I'll
just
tell
used
you,
to it. How do you deal with peace and quiet?
I'm so used to it. And so
can you sleep? Can you sleep in peace and quiet?
This is like background noise to me now. with all the unrest happening in DC, I will hear the sirens on my screen and outside of my window. Nuts. So I hear it all the time, but it sounds like they're quiet now. So go ahead.
So you write about Ralph Northam being caught in this scandal with blackface, and then you write about the fact that the other guy, the next guy in line, had allegations from a woman against him for sexual assault, Justin Fairfax. And it's really this whole section here is interesting because basically the point that you're making is about black voters and why they might vote the way that they vote. And when it comes to Joe Biden, I think he's a perfect example here of this, which is you're saying that black people just they have to trust that white people are going to vote for this person before they do. It's not their favorite choice. If they had their favorite choice, there'd be a long list of candidates that aren't even running. But it's more about who's the most likely person to get elected. We'd rather keep Ralph Northam as opposed to what could be. We'd rather have Joe Biden because we think, whether or not it's right, we black voters, especially older black voters, apparently think that he has the best chance of beating Trump. Explain what I'm trying to muddle through because I can't find the exact quote in your book.
No, I got you. I think black voters are very pragmatic, right? Look, it's not that black people are so excited about Joe Biden, but when they saw that, white voters were willing to cast votes for him and said, okay, even when it came to Barack Obama, black people liked Obama, but they were concerned, like, it's just not his time. We don't know that white people will vote for him. After he won Iowa, it changed a lot of people's outlook. And so I will tell you, it's very frustrating to me to see a lot of the Bernie people so upset because Bernie didn't make it that they're saying they're not going to vote. And to me, this punctuates privilege because do you think that I, as a black woman, have ever been excited about casting a ballot for the people that we've had to vote for, save for Barack Obama, because I was genuinely excited to vote for him. But for the most part, you know how many devils black people had to vote for? But what do? We pull our shit together and we go and save democracy time and again. So for all these people who are tweeting and pouting and like, it should have been Bernie, I'm not voting. Get the fuck out of here with that. It just seems like you don't give a shit about this country the same way we do. And we built this bitch for nothing, it's ridiculous. And you have people who are just throwing a temper tantrum and taking a shit on the country because their, favored candidate didn't make it. And it's infuriating to hear that. And I'll tell you, it's equally infuriating to see cable panels of people try to explain this and get it wrong time and again. You'll have a panel full of white people trying to dissect the black vote and get the entire narrative incorrect, which is why I titled the book what I did.
And it is such a good book, and everybody can pre-order it right now. I learned so much in reading it, and I'm really psyched to finally connect with you. And I think that I don't know. Who did you write the book for? I guess because I want to say I know who I want to read this book, and I wonder when you were writing the book how much you thought about your audience, white men, white women.
So I wrote the book for black voters, or really black people who have been so discounted out of democracy. But I wanted to be very clear because anytime I write something, a lot of times I'll write something about black people or people of color. And I always make a point to say, but this is about black people. It's not exclusively for black people. Everyone should read this. And so when you're writing a book, the process I found is helpful if you're writing it to someone. So I shouldn't say I wrote the book for black people. I wrote it to black people. But I want everyone to read this because I think the difference in the audiences will be that black people will say, yes, say that. I completely agree. I think there are a lot of white people who will say, what? Huh? I never knew that. Like, how did I go? There'll be some black people who read it and say, what? That happened? I never learned about that in school. How was it possible that I lived my life as a black person and never knew that? I think there will be, if media isn't so defensive, if the media landscape could read this and say, you know what, she raises some really good points and we should do better. So there is a large swath of constituencies, candidates, people who want to run for office. And it's like, well, I don't really know how to reach out to black voters. I made a specific point to have a chapter just for you. to say this is a better way to engage my constituents or Black people. So really a large swaths of constituencies, I think, I hope will find this book informative, helpful, sometimes entertaining, sometimes infuriating. But either way, Pete, I have to tell you, I'm so excited to talk about it with literally everybody. July can't get here fast enough. I was excited that you invited me to do this. But it's COVID times, and I happen to know that you and Ellie went for drinks, and I want my drinks with Pete whenever life opens up again.
Well, we didn't. Okay, but you're not insinuating that we had those drinks before COVID.
I know, pre-COVID. I'm just saying because it's COVID.
You don't want to drink with Ellie during COVID in a loud bar, because I'm telling you right now, there's a lot of spittle.
A lot of aerosol.
There's a lot of spittle that happens in a loud bar. Ellie,
I can imagine.
Ellie does not have an inside voice anywhere.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't.
That's
why we love him.
Of course, yeah. From the moment I met him, one of the most profound sentences in your book is the candor. The candor in this book may leave some gatekeepers troubled, and I was like, I'm a gatekeeper, and I understand
people
why
need to be troubled, and I had to be comfortable making people uncomfortable. So, you know.
Do you mind ending our interview with the section I emailed you? Can you check your email?
Oh, yes. I will check my email. You see the sun is slowly creeping up this side, too. So it's going to cook me in a minute. All right. An email from Pete. Oh, you did. You sure did. Oh, yes. You want me to read this?
Do you need to... You said that like you were hesitating. I'm like, well, you wrote it.
No, I'm happy to read it.
No, do you need any context for that? Do you need to set it up, as they say? Okay.
No, I think it's pretty straightforward. Do you think it needs context?
I don't think so.
Okay, let's go for it. America was not founded on peace and prosperity. I'm sorry, let me start over. Edit that part out, and I'm going to start over, repeat. And scene. America was not founded on peace and prosperity. It was taken from the Native Americans with blood and fury. It was not built on equity and equality. It was built on the backs of the enslaved. The country did not allow opportunity for everyone. It afforded power to a privileged few. Their American dream was our American nightmare. Black people lived in constant fear that the power of white people could at any moment and without any notice devastate their entire world. Let's not feign surprise when white supremacy rears its ugly head again and again and again. It's a system that is as American as apple pie and as old as the Battle of Jamestown.
I love it. I mean, I hate it, but I love it.
Thank you,
Say Aloud, or Black Voters, White Narratives, and Saving Our Democracy is a book that you can order right now. Pre-order right now. Get it up on top of advanced books, and follow Tiffany on Instagram and especially on Twitter, where I basically go to your timeline like a couple times a day, but like, ooh, I wonder if Tiffany's tweeted anything. Get all excited. Stay safe, and congratulations. This book is so good, and it's clear that you put a ton of research and a lot of hard work into it. And I'm a much better person for having read it.
Thank you so much, Pete, and thank you for sharing your platform with me and inviting me on. And I'm happy to come back anytime.
Anytime you want. Every day. Let's do it. We should do the co-host a podcast. All right.
Exactly. Love it.
Pre-order that book. Tell Tiffany you heard her on this podcast by tweeting her at Tiffany D. Cross. Say, I heard you with Pete Dominic. You were great. I'm getting your book. And that'll go a long way, as it always does. All right. Next, I want to thank Dan McDonald. I think I do it again here during the interview, who is a longtime listener and supporter, subscriber, friend of mine, lives nearby. Great guy. Very funny, very smart. Dan McDonald. Dan, thank you, because he alerted me to my next guest's work. And that was actually yesterday morning. And I reached out to him and got him booked that afternoon. And I think we have discovered a new, amazing, brilliant guest for the show. I pride myself on finding academics who are very smart, credible, experienced, accomplished people, and who are also really good, assertive, articulate communicators. And listen to the way that this guy talks. He's just so straight ahead. No ums, no ands, no editing of him needed at all. Sometimes, believe it or not, I have to edit a lot of ums and ands out. And he's got like research in his mind at his fingertips. He really did remind me of our friend, the great Aaron Carroll. I think we found the Aaron Carroll of sociology. I'm very excited to introduce him to you. For the first time on the show, RashawnRay.com, at Sociologist Ray on Twitter, Dr. Rashawn Ray. Dr. Rashawn Ray, University of Maryland. Thank you so much for joining me. And I should say Brookings Institute. He's got a lot of different affiliations. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Really enjoy your work and all the work that you do. So thank you for having me on the show. Very funny.
Are you saying my reputation precedes me? Is that what you're saying, Doctor?
It does. I follow a lot of people and a lot of things in the media. So it's, as an academic, especially given the type of work I do, rarely do I get the chance to interact with people in your profession in this way.
Hey, I like to make academics media stars because I didn't have a lot of academics in my background, and so I like the access that media allows me to, PhDs like you. And a shout out to a longtime listener and friend Dan McDonald, who tweeted me your stuff this morning, your paper at Brookings, because he's the one that put you on the map for me. So I'm really excited to have discovered your work. You are a sociologist, and I took a sociology course. I am fascinated by the study of sociology, and I just wanted you to, and I think everybody should be, and I wanted you to kind of explain what it is that you are an expert in, because I think it's a really important part of everything that we're talking about or we're about to. Sociology. What is it?
Yeah, well, thanks. It's always glad to hear people who have taken a sociology class and enjoyed it, which actually I think is a lot of people. People just don't know what it is. And essentially, as sociologists, what we do is we study how people's attitudes, emotions, and behaviors are impacted by the broader social institutions in society. Social institutions like we'll be talking about today, such as criminal justice and policing, or family, education, work. These are all what we call social institutions that govern our lives, that then structure where we are in the socioeconomic hierarchy. So based on people's occupation, instantly structures who they interact with, the type of conversations they have, similar with race and policing. Simply by people being of a different race, it completely structures the way that people interact with law enforcement. We then study the way that those structural conditions manifest on people to impact what they think, what they feel, and how they behave.
Well done, sir. Very well explained. I think that a lot of times, I just had a guy say this to me today on Twitter, people will talk about choices. Life is about choices, and nothing really fires me up, makes me more angry than that, because I feel like life is about opportunity and not choices. Everybody can make good choices and bad choices, but your choices a lot of times are based on the opportunities that you've had in life, the role models that you had, the mentors. And, I think that it's so much more about opportunity than it is choice. Am I driving at anything that's intelligent?
Of course. Yeah, I completely agree. The only time people really say that life is about choices are the ones who have been privileged to be able to enact those choices, because they can't really see the structural conditions that go over their lives.
Yes.
Everyone who has some type of barriers based on class or race or gender, sexual orientation, ability, that those are oftentimes what we call micro level type of occurrences that deal with our identities. But people who have come from low income neighborhoods, people who live in rural America, people who live in urban America where there's more lead in their water than the actual water that they need to drink, they very much understand what we do as sociologists, that life is about, to your point, what we call opportunity structures. So that's a way in which we take this whole opportunity argument, which is trying to highlight that we can just pull ourselves up from our bootstraps, and actually highlights the structure. So the families that people are born into, the schools that we attend, the neighborhoods we grow up in, all of these things determine more of our outcomes than even our ability. There are thousands of geniuses in low income, particularly predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods in the country, who never get to actualize their geniusness. And there's no better proof of that, I think. Well, I think it's several, but one of them, and I've testified before Congress about small businesses and patents, that one of the big things you see is that as kids grow up, their IQs are relatively similar. And then all of a sudden, despite that IQ, the people who end up inventing products, the people who end up being deemed geniuses are more likely to come from upper class, predominantly white families. That's not because those kids are just smarter than everybody else. It means they have more opportunities. They are better prepared to actualize how smart they actually are.
I feel like sociology, unfortunately, suffers from a kind of it's not the science that you would want it to be. And it ends up being a lot of different anecdotes. But the one piece of science, of research that I've always thought was really kind of important and interesting was the success rate that a person has if you measure success by education or income or kind of traditional measures is defined by the zip code you were born into, also defined by whether or not you had access to universal pre-K. So it really begins very early in your life. And then the zip code you're born into can determine, and so often sadly does determine, your success in our country especially. And there's a real lack of social mobility or economic mobility in this country in a way that there is not in the rest of the civilized, wealthy countries in the world. What about that one metric, the zip code, the universal pre-K stuff? Doesn't that determine so much, unfortunately, of how we're going to turn out?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it determines a whole lot. And so we could take a map of Washington, D.C., Baltimore, St. Louis, Memphis, Detroit, New York, and take a map from 1920 and overlay it with a map from 2020. And what people will see is that the race and class composition from a century ago is almost 100% identical to the way it looks today. That's because our zip code oftentimes determines our outcomes. And part of that, I've done this work in Washington, D.C. and in other places where we look at how these zip codes, and part of what I've been writing on COVID-19 as well as on policing, is that our zip code, if you give me your zip code, I can pretty much tell you how much money you make and what your race is simply by your zip code. And in 2020, that is so unfortunate that that's still the case, that neighborhoods are just as segregated now as they were in the 1960s. That should unnerve us all, that limits people's opportunities simply based on where they live. Then that impacts your school, that impacts your school funding, that impacts the type of jobs that you have access to, that impacts your healthy food options, how many grocery stores there are, that impacts how many pharmacies, how many hospitals are nearby. It then impacts how much police officers are in your neighborhood, whether or not they live in your neighborhood and treat you as a neighbor, or whether or not they over-police your neighborhood and treat you like a criminal. All of these things can be determined by our zip code. And I think it's one big thing we know about zip code, which again is linked to race and class, is that even when people gain some type of educational degree, that their zip code is highly linked to their ability to garner wealth. Because most people don't gain wealth from just becoming millionaires and being self-driven. No, people oftentimes gain wealth by being passed down, typically passed down through property that their parents and grandparents owned from the house that they grew up in, that they then take out a home equity line of credit to go to college so they don't go in debt. They then sell that house or refinance that house to put money on a small business, to do all these sort of things that allow them to actualize the American dream. And for other people who are oftentimes low income or black or brown in this country, have less of those opportunities.
And it's by design, those zip codes, right? I mean, we can now probably have a pretty good historical lesson. It's by design, from redlining to property taxes to, obviously opportunity to vote and candidates, and you can go on and on. But it is, make no mistake, it is by design.
I mean, you hit the nail on the head. Yeah, it is. And all people have to do is do a few things. I advise people to do this. Look at your area, your county, your state. Look at the zip code map. Look at the school district map. Look at the voting map. You'll see that the lines go all over the place. I mean, they're just doing all kind of crazy things. And that's because, to your point, is by design. Someone made it up. Oftentimes a man made it up. A white man made it up to determine who had access and who didn't. When people hear redlining, what does that mean? That literally meant that in Chicago, about a century ago, they took a red line through the city, and black people are on one side, white people on the other, based on actual legal regulation that was in place at the time due to restrictive covenants and HOAs and that sort of thing. And they made a decision that not only were they going to relegate Black people to living in one place, they also were not going to invest in those places. How does this manifest? Well, with COVID-19, about 95% of Black-owned small businesses did not get access to the Payment Protection Program funding that came out of the COVID-19 stimulus. That is criminal. Everyone should have an equal opportunity, and they don't. And it's based on where you live and what you look like.
I wonder what that's about. I wonder if that had to do with like resources and knowledge of knowing that that's available to them, or if it's about whoever's handing that out and strictly being discriminatory in terms of how they hand it out. Because, it's got to be hard to, I'll give government some credit. It's got to be difficult to try to figure out who qualifies for the loans and who doesn't. But clearly, I've heard story after story. This is going to be a legacy, not unlike so many other horrific situations where people of color are making progress, doing well, and something happens and they lose it all. And I can list examples, and I'm not a scholar like you are, so I'm sure you have a long list. But I just wanted, but let me move on because we won't know the answer to the PPE thing.
And I think it's two of them. Just real quick, I think it's both of the things you said. Like I've researched this over the past month. It's a lack of social networks because based on redlining, banks are less likely to be in predominantly Black and low-income neighborhoods, so they don't have these networks to be able to go to the person at the bank and say, hey, can you make sure that my application gets in the queue? Whereas people in other neighborhoods can. And then, unfortunately, discrimination does happen that, some people were just less likely to be paid attention to because they were Black, similar to COVID and policing, which we're, about to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll get to that. I got one more just kind of sociology question, which does lead us to policing to some extent, which is I'll never forget interviewing a sociologist who was talking about crime in urban areas. And it was really fascinating because he talked about, again, going back to opportunity. When I was, I'll give the first anecdote. I want to hear some from you, but I'll throw one out there. When I was 15, me and a bunch of my friends were arrested in upstate New York for bashing mailboxes during the broad daylight.
Classic teenager thing.
Stand by me.
You had the bats, but just knocking off the mailboxes.
Also, let's be honest, this is a white thing. Black people don't play mailbox baseball, I'm pretty sure. But I'd like to see if there's even one example. Yeah, maybe. So, we were country guys. The point was, the reason that we did that was because we had 2 hours before lacrosse practice began. The point being, we had free time. What this sociologist talked to me about is that young people tend to commit crimes when they don't have a place to be, when they don't have a program. And
3 to 6 p.m.
Right. So in lower income areas and more impoverished areas where there are less programs, after school programs, boys and girls clubs and so on, or they're maxed out or whatever. That's why you see a lot of the more gang activity and why the crime, because there's nowhere else to turn. There's nothing else to do. Yeah. What is the research behind that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Right after school until people's parents get home is when crime is committed. And, I haven't for the life of me figured out why in the United States we time our schools to be the way they are, to be so discongruent to the work lives of most people in America. One thing people don't know about, and, John Dewey historically helped us to sort through this as he was studying farming in schools, is that originally the school system was set up the way it was so that it could align with farmers, so that kids could go farm before school, and then after school, they could farm again before it got dark. Well, why do we still do that? Why do we still have that incongruous system? And to your point, when it comes to programs, if you're in a more affluent area, then you're going to have more types of programs that you can do right after school. If you're in a less affluent area, you're going to have less so. And a lot of that deals with the fact that schools and school funding is primarily driven by property taxes. One of the best books that people could read is called A Shame of a Nation by Jonathan Kozol. And what he highlights, he did a large, really sociological study, but he was a journalist, went to 6 cities around the country, started to really notice how federal funding for schools was decreasing and local property tax funding for schools was increasing. So if you live in an area that is poor, guess what? Your school is going to be poor. And the unfortunate thing about that is that America promises kids what? An equal education. We are so far away from that part of one of the manifestations of that is a lack of school funding, a lack of funding for after school programs, a lack of funding for community centers, a lack of funding for different types of activities. So you mentioned lacrosse, like in neighborhoods I grew up in, we didn't even know what lacrosse was, hadn't even heard about it, because certain sports cost more money than other sports. And so it became easy to focus on basketball or football because you know what? You only need like a messed up rim and a ball. Like you don't even need the right ball. And so it's similar to soccer or baseball in Latin America, that part of the sports that people are focused on, it's not because those are just the sports they want to play or because supposedly they can run or jump faster or higher. When, as you know, playing lacrosse, and I know seeing people at Maryland play lacrosse, because University of Maryland, as you know, has one of the best lacrosse programs for men and women, that they are out there running. They could play, and most of them are so athletic, they could play any sport they wanted to. That was the sport they chose to play. And so that is an example of how opportunity structure really guides our life.
Yeah, it's a higher barrier to entry. I would even argue that any sport that requires an investment in equipment is going to be harder for people that don't have access to it. Not to mention the facilities, a hockey rink, or even a soccer field. You don't have a lot of green spaces in urban areas as well, which is a huge issue. So I think that we have to now go even further back in history to talk about, as we get to this issue of police brutality and what we're seeing in America right now, and why people are out in the streets and protesting. I think you got to tell us about slave patrols.
Yeah. So one of the big things, as you know, from the piece that I wrote at Brookings on how, bad apples come from rotten trees and policing, is that with slave patrols, when Black people were on plantations, for a long time, we had a narrative that they just went along with it, which was so far from the truth, that they were aiming to resist in so many ways on a regular basis. And one of the ways, of course, they resisted was to flee, was to run away. And I think if people want to see what I think is one of the best slave era movies I've ever seen, people have to watch Harriet. Not only is the acting phenomenal.
Really? Is that out yet?
Yeah. It's out. It's out. It's out on video.
I remember seeing the trailer for that and going, I can't wait, and then never seeing what happened. Like, don't remember. So, and it's that good? You're saying?
It's that
surprised
good.
I haven't heard more about it. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, it got caught up in, I think people heard about it, but it got caught up in whatever's been happening over the past year, right? But yeah, it is literally, I think, the best slave era movie, and I'll tell you why. Because as the parent of little kids, it was one of the first movies that my kids could watch. And that's because they didn't show anyone getting lynched. They didn't show anyone getting beaten. Some people did get hit. Some people did get shot, but it wasn't overly bloody. It was really a movie about uplift, about what Harriet Tubman was able to do and resistance. So I like that narrative rather than some of the other ones from 12 Years a Slave or, even Roots historically and other types of movies. The point of mentioning that, though, is that people were running away. And so in Harriet, you can see the people who were part of the slave patrol who were trying to catch her and other people. That was how law enforcement originated in the United States. That then shifted to becoming what we know as law enforcement today. And part of that shift also formally including the KKK, because those slave patrols then became integrated with the KKK. We can't extrapolate that. We never dealt with that. The other thing, finally, is that it's part of a continuum that links to today, which is that FBI reports have shown that over the past 2 decades, white nationalist organizations have aimed to infiltrate certain occupations and certain aspects of what we call in sociology social institutions. Law enforcement and criminal justice has been one of those. And there are several examples we can provide where we see this, from the cop in Louisiana recently who wrote on Facebook that it's unfortunate that more Black people didn't die from COVID-19, or the officers in Florida who were going to KKK meetings. And people say, oh, well, those are just a few bad apples. See, that's where you get wrong. If you have bad apples, apples have to come from some type of tree. And if those apples are bad, then the tree and the roots are bad. And the roots of law enforcement that's bad is slave patrols. And we have never dealt with the legacy of that, as people call it, the good old boys, as we say it where I'm from in Tennessee and Georgia, that we have never dealt with that good old boy system that is highly discriminatory and racist and honestly leads to the death of people like Ahmaud Arbery.
I mean, has anybody been able to conduct any kind of accurate research on how endemic white supremacy is within police departments in America? Because, I mean, and forget about the South. I mean, NYPD. We saw an NYPD officer flash the white supremacy hand signal the other day. We have heard these stories so much. I mean, I've heard anecdotally so many things. And I think sometimes being white, you tend to hear even more because they think you're you're on their side. And I unfortunately make assumptions too often that police officers are overtly racist, like that they even sometimes join the police force because they know they're going to have access to beating up brown and black bodies. I mean, obviously, a lot of the people that join the police force obviously just like, the adrenaline and being thugs and being authoritarians, but specifically against anybody, but certainly specifically against minorities. How much, has anybody done a deep dive on how systemic racism in police departments in the United States of America is?
So I think there has been some evidence in some regard. So I think that there have been some good books. Let's take courts, and then I'll get back to policing. But I think when it comes to courts, one of the best ways to think about it, Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve is a professor at Brown. She had a book called Crooked County recently, amazing book, where she highlighted the deep ways that racism operates within our court system. I think when it comes to policing, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have put out reports talking about the extent to which they think it exists. And see, this is what's key, is that do I think that it's a large percentage of them? No. But to your point, you know what I think happens? These white supremacists talk to other cops, and they're mostly talking to white cops, but they then talk to some black cops. And so I know two things. There are two big patterns of policing that I know from my research. And, again, I've studied policing for about a decade. I've worked with dozens of police departments around the country, large departments, small, medium-sized departments. I've worked with the Department of Homeland Security. I've worked with the U.S. military. I have one of the most innovative implicit bias training courses in the United States. We also have a virtual reality decision-making program where we have officers come to the University of Maryland and go through our virtual reality training to improve their decision-making. I know a lot of this stuff, and I sit in these meetings. Two big patterns. First, it doesn't matter what the race of the officer is, they end up treating black bodies the same way. So there's one key stat, which is that black Americans are 3.5 times more likely than white Americans to be killed by police when they're not attacking or when they have a weapon. So that these people aren't attacking. They don't have a weapon. Who says that? Police officers themselves. But this is the thing. It's the thing, Pete. We only have data from like 16 states. We know how many people get killed by jellyfish every year. We don't know how many people are killed by the police. Now, a lot of people say that's because the police don't want us to know. That is part of it, but similar to what we were talking about PPP, it's not all of it. The other part of it is that most police departments they're like In the Heat of the Night, which was one of my favorite shows growing up. Like In the Heat of the Night, it's 10 officers. They don't have the capacity to even collect data and even know what to do with it. And so we need some type of federal oversight, which is what Senator Cory Booker literally just proposed again. He keeps having to propose it, which is to create a national database of police killings and a police registry. The other thing, though, within police departments is different from outside of police departments. So although that police officers don't treat people differently based on the race of the cop, internally when they're sanctioned, the research I've done shows that it's a drastic difference, that Black and Latino officers, particularly Black officers, are much more likely to be sanctioned for similar types of violations than white officers. So in that regard, it simply mimics what we see in the broader criminal justice system related to race.
Wow.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. And I just got to make this point because you were talking about the history of this. There's another part of this history.
Go ahead.
In 1952, there was an organization founded called the Emerald Society. It was a group of Irish firefighters and police officers founded in Boston. It's everything you might imagine it is to be founded in 1952 in Boston. And that is a racist organization that is infiltrated. When people always talk about how do they infiltrate police? Well, they become police officers and then they take over leadership in the Fraternal Order of Police. And then they create sub-chapters from the Emerald Society and these organizations to be what, for example, in Prince George's County is a group called literally the Good Old Boys, where they say we bust heads and take names in Prince George's County. That is the type of outcomes that lead to white nationalism being ingrained within policing and lead to what we're talking about with George Floyd.
The Emerald Society is still active. I'm looking it up.
Yeah.
I mean, they're everywhere.
Yeah, without a doubt. And, if you ask them, they're like, what? No, we're not racist. We're
just Irish.
Yeah. Of course you are. Like your roots was founded to maintain and kind of bring back some of the stuff that the KKK had implemented after the Civil War.
When I criticize police departments, police officers, so often people respond with, then see how you do without police officers. Or so you're not going to call a police officer. And I'm like, first of all, that is a ridiculously lazy response. I am not saying get rid of law enforcement. I'm not that radical, although we could talk about a society that wouldn't require it. I'm saying reform police departments, change the culture, change the rules, make there be responsibility for your actions, make there be consequences for your actions, change the training. There's all kinds of reforms. Campaign Zero is a really interesting campaign, and all. I don't know what works. You've studied this, and you have all kinds of ideas that would work. But the point I'm saying is, I'm not saying get rid of cops. I'm saying completely reform police departments. Obviously, what you said about measuring statistics and understanding data, because they're all so fragmented, all these local police departments, 18,000 or something like that around the country. But we need law enforcement reform desperately. The problem with that, I see, you tell me if I'm wrong, goes back to pretty much everything else. It's campaign finance and police departments and how much, how much control or power the police unions have and cities all over the country. They make it very, very difficult for policymakers and politicians to create any kind of change within a police department. So what are the reforms that you think are necessary and that would really change the face of law enforcement in America today and make it far more difficult for them to get away with what they've been getting away with for generations, outside of the obvious thing that people know about body cams? And you could talk to us about the research on if they work or not.
Ditto. So the way I think about it, I think it was 6 years ago, I started working with some large police departments, and they wanted me to come in and do two things. They wanted, and I'm the director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research in Maryland. We call it LASER, and policing is one of the main things that we do, is we research policing and provide policy solutions specific to departments and then statewide and at the federal level. And they had us come in. They wanted us to evaluate the implementation of their body-worn camera program, everything from the product to how long the body-worn camera should stay on. Should it stay on? Should it cut off? When the lights come on, should it come on? All of these technical things that to police officers matter, right? Like we surveyed and interviewed 300 police officers. All right, so we did a very large study. It's not like I was talking to 3 people. And then we started doing implicit bias trainings with them. And we would do every new recruit class. And there were a series of troubling things that would happen. So I'll give a couple of stories, because I really don't think people can grasp this.
Yeah.
I remember we were in a training for body-worn cameras. We were observing a training. It was an in-classroom training. They were showing people how to use the cameras. Video comes on. An officer is standing. A person is standing in front of them. And the guy has a weapon. It's unclear if it's a gun or a knife at that point. Officer pulls his gun. He says, put that down. The guy doesn't. Officer shoots him. Officer runs over. He has a body-worn camera. You see him running over. And he pulls out like a kit, like some stuff. And he's like, hey, man, hang in there. I'm going to save you. Well, he didn't clear the weapon of the guy. The guy picks up the gun, shoots the officer in the chest. Thank goodness that the officer had on a bulletproof vest. The training officer turns the light on, turns the video off, and said, that's why you always shoot center mass, and that's why you always shoot to kill. I was like, holy crap, this was a session about body-worn cameras. I was like, how did we get here? Then I remember we were doing one of their shoot, don't shoot scenarios, their training. So we upgraded the traditional kind of duck hunt, right? Playing Nintendo 2D duck hunt. A lot of police departments still use that. We were like, what are y'all doing? So we upgraded it to look like Fortnite, right? So I think about my kids playing Fortnite. So we upgraded it. That's what we use now. They go into a virtual world, 360-degree fully immersed. So they're doing this duck hunt version. And one of the officers said something wrong and got shot by, supposedly got shot in a simulation. There were officers sitting in the dark with pellet guns and shot him with red pellet guns, then made him walk around for a week with his uniform bloody. What do you think that does to you when that happens? And then let me this final story, because I really don't like when I seen this, and I should also add, I have 6 cops in my family. My great uncle was the first black chief of police in my hometown. My granddad served 21 years in the military, Purple Heart, Bronze Star. He was a drill sergeant. I was the outlier in my family. They were like, oh, okay, Ray wants to go to school and do whatever the heck sociology is. So I was the outlier. So my family comes from this, military. Like my mom got into West Point. I think there's a black woman getting into West Point in the 70s. It's crazy.
Wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. She got out to raise me because she got pregnant with me by a sergeant in the military. But yeah, she got into West Point. So the last thing, even though this stuff blows my mind, so we're doing this training course and an officer walks in, there's a wall of people on the wall. He comes in, he takes a sheet of paper, and we see people's attitudes change. He takes it, he puts tape on it, and he slaps a picture on the wall, and he leaves. Everybody gets quiet. It's about 50 recruits. And we were like, so what just happened? What went on? And they said, so that wall is the faces of every police officer who's been killed in the line of duty since we've been in training. And when I looked at the wall, in the grand scheme, it wasn't tons of faces, but you know what? It doesn't matter. If I'm about to be a police officer and I see one face, I'm going to have a problem. And then one of the next weeks, the police officers came in, the training staff, the trainers, they were just in there, the recruits, they were doing whatever they do, came in and sprayed up the whole recruitment class with pellet guns that says, you all should have been paying attention and checking your 6. People don't understand the depth by which the warrior mentality is put on police officers. And it had me start realizing that as bad as policing is, the fact that every 40 hours, if we just look at black people, every 40 hours, a black person is killed by police in this country, every 40 hours, that it surprised me that it wasn't more, given what I was seeing. That's because every 40
hours, a black person is committing a crime that deserves that there to be violence, is what people will say.
That's what they say. But again, the research doesn't bear that out, with the stat that black people are 3.5 times more likely to be killed when they're not attacking or have a weapon. And to your point, when it comes to reforms, do I think body-worn cameras matter? Do I think implicit bias training matters? Yeah. But they're limited because they focus on the bad apples. They don't focus on the rotten tree. To do that, we need to ensure that officers like the ones in Minneapolis can never work in law enforcement again. And this is important for people to know. Officer Chauvin had nearly 20 police misconduct complaints. His cases have been brought before a grand jury before. He's not the only one. The officers who killed Tamir Rice had previously worked at other places, had essentially been fired, but the Fraternal Order Police told him to resign before that happened. He shouldn't have been a cop. The officer who killed Antoine Rose in Pittsburgh a few years ago, same situation. First day out of the academy, killed someone, had previously worked as a cop somewhere else. We need to make sure they can't work. And then we need to restructure police civilian payouts for misconduct away from taxpayer money onto police department insurances.
That's a really interesting reform that you suggest. And I think it would go a long way. The problem I see is all of these ideas that you're suggesting are not realistic, because the police department will never, it's not like they're like the gun lobby. It's not like, most special interests, some you can break them a little bit around the edges and create, change. But with police departments, it seems very difficult to create these reforms. You have these suggestions that are pragmatic. They would create more justice, equality. They would save more lives. But cops don't want to do any of this stuff. They certainly don't want to allow their pensions, their insurance to be at stake. What do you do about that? That's politics, right?
Yeah, without a doubt. I think part of it is how we think about it. There are definitely people advocating to deal with pensions or Fraternal Order of Police dues. Those are ideas people have. I think we can do what I'm proposing without messing with pensions. Now, I definitely think if a person's terminated for police misconduct, they shouldn't get their pension. Like, they shouldn't get taxpayer money for doing an injustice to people. With that being said, I think it's a way to do it without messing with pensions, which is, so police departments already have, and a lot of officers have insurance themselves. Not even messing with that. This is a department level insurance. Police departments have insurances for equipment. Okay, you wreck your car, right? The same way we do with our vehicle insurance. Similar to how hospitals have insurance on physicians who perform surgery at their hospital. Police departments will have insurances for officers who go out and patrol the areas that they control. So part of what that means then is for police departments is what'll happen. They have a premium, just like anybody else. They pay their premium. When something bad happens, what happens? Your premium goes up. All right. And then all of a sudden it gives police departments the ability to have a market-driven metric to say, have a list of just say 10 officers where they say, geez, Officer Chauvin is costing us a crap load of money compared to all the other officers. And it gives then police chiefs the ability to then say, you are costing us too much money. We can't have you here. And let me tell you how much money we're talking about. In Chicago alone, over the past 20 years, they have paid out $600 million, over $600
taxpayer
million.
money. That's taxpayer money.
Taxpayer money.
That's why they don't care.
Taxpayer money. But this is the key thing, though. It's not about.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. $600 million in lawsuits against the cops for all kinds of horrible things. Go ahead. Sorry.
Exactly. Yeah. And St. Louis has this. Little Rock has it. Baltimore, New York, Washington, D.C. I mean, you name a city, they have it. To your point, if Chicago is interesting because they actually appropriate funding for police misconduct. It is in the budget already. So the point I'm getting at, what I've learned about policing is I used to go to police departments to make the change. No, that's not where you go. You go to the people who enact the policies that police officers implement. So you go to the policymakers. Your state legislatures is the main place to go. I think that the federal level makes sense too, but the state level is the primary place. That's where you get the laws changed at. And there is, again, with this market-driven approach, what you can show is how much money would be saved in jurisdictions and at the state level by making this shift. And I think for a lot of police chiefs I talk to, they want something to be able to make that change, because at that point they're appointed, right? They're outward facing people. They're not inward facing people like the rest of their staff. Right. They're outward facing. In order for them to stay in office, they got to be reappointed by the next mayor, next county official to stay in place.
What happens if you're a police officer and you turn in another police officer who's done something bad? Generally speaking, how does that go for you?
It doesn't go well. I mean, I can give some specific examples. It doesn't go well at all. Yep. And it's unfortunate. The blue wall of silence extends from police departments to courtrooms and prosecutors' offices. And I think we see that with the Ahmaud Arbery situation. What people should do is not just look at what happened to him in February from the video we've seen, but actually look at what happened with the police corruption in that city. So when people blow the whistle, and I know several who blown the whistle. Yeah. Small things happen, but they really impact your life. And I'm calling these small because I'm going to get to the big ones in a second. The small things are, you're not going to get promoted. Well, what does that do? That impacts your lifetime income for the rest of your life. If you're stuck at a sergeant and you should have been promoted to lieutenant and you don't because you said something about a bad apple, then that's impacting your life for the rest of your life, impacting your kids, how much money you can send your kids to college. All right. That then is going to increase the likelihood that you're going to work overtime, that you're going to be tired and stressed, that you're going to make poor decisions. Officers who talk about bad apples, they also then get put on bad assignments. What does that look like? That means they're put on the night shift, even though they might be 10 years on the force. There's no way they should be working that shift because people know they got kids. They need to be at home. They then get assigned places that are far away from their homes. In a place, say, like Prince George's County, Maryland, that's 1 million people, 550 square miles. You could be an hour and a half away from work now because they put you in the district out in the sticks. Those are the small things. The large things are you get demoted. You're on a call and officers don't respond to you. You get stigmatized. They start finding ways to get you out of the force, to force you to retire. I've talked to officers in Tennessee, Maryland, Missouri, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, who have all had these same incidents where when they blow the whistle, then all of a sudden it becomes a machine that comes after them. And when it comes after them, they get them on such trumped up charges. Like this one officer was forced to retire because he asked another chief at another station whether or not his son could switch days to be off to help him move. And they said that he overextended his reach because he was a captain and he was using his power to get that person to switch his son's schedule.
Well, listen, This has to be part one. I got to actually literally go right now to take my daughter, and I are going to a protest right now.
Good for you.
So let me wrap it up right now, and we'll do part 2 and 3. This has been really enlightening. I can't thank you enough for your time today, Dr. Rashawn Ray.
Thank you for having me. Anytime.
What did I tell you? Did we find a new star? Sociology's fascinating, but this guy's an expert on police-civilian relationships, obviously, has a ton of credible experience, and what an awesome speaker he is. Great interview, Dr. Rashawn Ray. I did not want that to end, and I look forward to talking with him again. Thank you, of course, to Tiffany Cross. Great to finally get her on the show. I recorded both of them in video. I'll try to put them and a whole bunch more. I gotta post a whole bunch of stuff on YouTube. I keep running out of time. A lot of work. I think I'm going to hire Ava to do it. I think I'm going to have to make her do it. Thank you very much for your support with your paid subscription, everybody. We're almost to 600. It's absolutely amazing. I'm so excited by the progress of the show. More and more people listening. The numbers are going up. I'm excited that we're not advertising anything, that is fully independent media and supported by you, the subscriber. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. And I look forward to meeting you and hearing more about you and your life and your interests and your problems and who you want me to talk to about them. Go to patreon.com/Pete Dominick. Reach out to me, standupwithpete@gmail.com, or hit me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And I know everything is crazy right now. I'm with you. I feel it. I'm scared too. I'm nervous too. You are not alone. Let's talk about it on tonight at 8 p.m. Tonight at 8 p.m. Just check the link on Patreon. If you're a subscriber, you can check it out. If not, then sign up. I hope to see you there.